Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you couldn't fully be yourself? Maybe you hesitated to share an idea, express an opinion, never mind present an opposing view. Or maybe you felt like you didn't belong. And as a leader, have you ever been made aware of an employee having this experience at work? I have Pasha Marlowe joining me to discuss the profound importance of psychological safety and belonging. Pasha Marlowe, whose pronouns are she, they, has 30 years of experience as a marriage and family therapist and neurodiversity coach. She specializes in the intersection of neurodiversity, disability, and LGBTQIA+. Pasha speaks to organizations and ERGs about neurodiversity-affirming practices, psychological safety, and neurobelonging. She encourages leaders to have a lens of inclusion and intersectionality to allow all, including those with the most marginalized identities, to be seen and heard. In this episode, Pasha and I discuss how Pasha got into such a specialized field of work, how as leaders we can create environments for psychological safety to exist, shaping our words and actions to contribute to psychological safety, continuing your own development to sharpen your lens of inclusion and intersectionality, and the work Pasha is doing for organizations. If you are new to the Women Taking the Lead podcast, hello and welcome. I am Jody Flynn, and my pronouns are she, her. I am the CEO and founder of Women Taking the Lead, a leadership development company that helps leaders to achieve their gender parity goals at all levels of leadership and in all divisions of an organization. We help to realize these results through consulting, coaching, leadership development programs, and keynotes. My goal is for this podcast to be a valuable resource for you and others in your organization of all genders to grow in your leadership. If we are not already connected on LinkedIn, please send me an invitation to connect. You can find me directly at linkedin.com/in/Jody Flynn, or you can search on the platform for Jody Flynn. I am very active on LinkedIn, so I should be at or near the top of your search results. Be sure to add a note to the invitation letting me know you're a listener of the podcast, and I would love to connect with you and get to know you better. Now, let's bring in Pasha. Pasha, welcome to the Women Taking the Lead podcast.
Thank you so much, Jody. Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. I'm excited for this conversation because we've kind of been dancing around doing this for a while, and we talked a couple of weeks ago, and it was like, full steam ahead. We are ready for this. Let's have this conversation. But before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes of what we're here to talk about, everyone's heard your professional bio, but we also want to know the woman. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about what you have going on in your personal life and what you're up to.
Thank you. I am a mama bear before most anything. I'm a mom of 3, 27, 25, and 16-year-olds. So I've been actively parenting for 27 years. So I can't separate myself from that. And it's the favorite part of my life. So I'll start there. In terms of hobbies and interests outside of work, and truth be told, work is one of my greatest pleasures and adventures at the moment. It challenges me, so I love it. I have taken up stand-up comedy, writing, producing, watching, and that has been really great for my brain. It's a mindful path to pleasure and joy and laughter, which doesn't come easy to me.
Yeah. Okay. I love this because I've been following you for a while. So I've seen a little bit of this journey. And when you say your work is your passion and your joy, I can let everyone know she's not just saying that to say that. I know a lot of people say that as like a validation of like, it's okay that I spend so much time thinking and immersed in my work because I do love it. you really do love it. So let's start there. How did you get into, because the intersectionality of the things you're up to, you speak on, the message you spread is very specialized. How did you get here?
Thank you. It's funny. It's specialized and common in the sense that
Mm,
now that I've been in this work, so because I was a therapist for 30 years and then I started leaning into neurodiversity, really mostly over the last 5 to 7 years, the intersection of neurodiversity and disability is there because the non-apparent disabilities including, cognitive differences, but also mental health issues, disabilities we can't see.
mm,
That those two are just intrinsically intertwined. But the correlation between neurodivergence and LGBTQ or queerness, really at about 2020, I noticed inside myself and inside almost all of my clients that there's this simultaneous coming out in many ways, coming out neurodivergent, coming out queer, coming out menopausal, coming out angry, coming out an activist, coming out just in so many ways, challenging norms, questioning norms. There's almost this reckoning and a fierce unraveling of norms. And when you unravel one norm, no doubt another will be unraveled right after it. So the intersection and the correlation is, they say the Venn diagram is a circle, like especially with younger generations.
yeah.
If you talk to someone who is neurodivergent, I will guess that they are likely also identifying somewhere along the LGBTQIA plus spectrum in the sense of, if anything, fluidity and not fully straight, not fully anything. It's
Mhm.
more fluid. Gen Z and Gen Alpha like come out more fluid. They just do. And
They
that's,
do reject the binaries, don't
yeah.
they? They do not like the extremes of the spectrum.
Yes, agreed. And so I think the three all make sense together, but I understand that it looks quite niche.
Yes, and I should say it's not that those generations don't like the extremes of the spectrum, but they don't like to be pigeonholed as having to be one or the other. That was more what I was thinking. And it's interesting you say it happened during the pandemic, because I'm just kind of speaking out loud where my brain went was like, yeah, as we were kind of restricted physically
Yes.
in terms of like our voice and our self-expression, like people were looking for outlets. Like, you can tell me I have to stay in my home, but you can't tell me I have to stay in my head.
Exactly. And we started exploring other avenues of learning or playing or creating. And for some of us, that ended up being for the first time ever having the time to listen to podcasts, to read books, to research. It was a gift in the time of quarantine to actually read more than the first third of my books. This is coming from my ADHD brain. I don't often finish them. I start them, but I don't finish them. And I started finishing them. I was like, oh my goodness, I see myself in these books. And during the pandemic, of course, remote work. So people's systems and structures were gone and started to kind of reflect their differences. And children were being remote schooled and homeschooled.
Mhm.
And then their learning differences, cognitive differences, intellectual differences, mental health issues were in the spotlight. And often for neurodivergent adults, they realize they're neurodivergent after their children are diagnosed through school.
I've seen that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Their child gets diagnosed, and all of a sudden they or their partner are like, wait a second, maybe we should also expand the testing to.
Yeah. Plus, there's a genetic component to a lot of neurodivergence, right? And
Mhm.
so, if your child is ADHD, there's like a 50% chance, and there's and that might even grow more
Mhm.
in terms of the research that's coming out. I've heard anything from 50 to 80%, depending. And so, and if you and your partner are, let's say, ADHD or autistic, it's just very likely that your child will be as well. And so just knowing that, and then you start really unraveling and outing your entire family tree, like, oh, that's why my family is the way they are. And that's a fun process when people first recognize or self-discover or get diagnosed formally. I'm very much honor lived experience and self-discovery, because formal diagnoses is inaccessible. It's not affordable. It's years of waiting. It's not always accurate. So I know that's a controversial statement to say that I honor lived experience, because people are worried that so many people are coming out. Oh, everyone's ADHD now. Everyone's autistic now. Is that going to leave not enough resources or medication for the people who really need it? And I don't think more people are ADHD and autistic. I think we've always been here. Speaking of those two neurotypes specifically right now, it's just that there's less stigma and there's more research specifically around girls and women, because only in the last 5 years did we even realize that girls and women present far differently than boys, and the stereotypical idea of what, for example, ADHD or autism looks like. But before I end this thought, neurodivergence includes far more than ADHD and autism. It includes Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, mental health struggles. It's anything that diverges from society's idea of what is the normal or right way to think or act or move. And if that's the case, I think more of us are neurodivergent than neurotypical. But it's misunderstood what that term is even.
Yeah. So case it, underscoring your point, like, this is just the state of the world right now. In the last 4 years, there was this boom of discovery, right? And people had more time to get curious, think about these things, question, read, research, all of that good stuff. And then, of course, we can't pretend to be one way in our personal life and show up at work differently. We might try to hide these things at work, right? But more and more people are demanding, especially with the younger generations, that I am accepted at work for who I am. And if I am not, I will go elsewhere. I will find something else. And so now there is this question of, because, and talent is, ongoing, like the big need in organizations. How do we get talent? How do we keep the talent that we have? There's, you don't want this like wheel of like people coming in, people coming out, and if people are leaving, it's for a reason. So I know top of mind for a lot of leaders, though they don't always have the answers, is how, as leaders, can we create environments for psychological safety to exist so people feel comfortable just being themselves at work?
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about is the number one problem, because you can hire, but if you don't support, you're not going to retain. And neurodivergent talent, or any talent, obviously, if you don't support your employees, but with neurodivergent talent, half of neurodivergent people are leaving their jobs or planning to leave their jobs, because there's this sense of inclusion in writing in a performative way. There's even talk about neurodiversity hiring programs where 30 to 40% of Fortune 500 companies are jumping on this because they see the benefit of a neurodiverse workforce. So they have these neurodiversity hiring programs. One, they don't know what that means, because what they really want is autistic workers. And I can go into the misunderstanding there and potentially the taking advantage of autistic minds in that sense. But if you say a neurodiversity hiring program and you're not opening up to all minds, all bodies, all brains, then it's not a neurodiversity hiring program. It's an autistic hiring program.
It's very selective.
Yeah. And if it's not stated as such, if I were to join such and such company under the neurodiversity hiring program, figuring, well, I'm neurodivergent. Let's say I wasn't autistic. I would feel completely excluded and uh, just misunderstood and disregarded immediately. So I would leave because it would be under false pretenses. So I think people need to be really accurate with the language that they use around inclusion. And as to your point about psychological safety, yes, like that's part of the support. And I always say that psychological safety doesn't exist in an organization unless the most vulnerable, the most underrepresented, the most marginalized people in the organization are able to speak their mind, talk about their mistakes, bring their feelings and opinions to the table. Because unless the most marginalized or vulnerable or underrepresented people can't, then it's not a psychologically safe environment.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing first and foremost is like, as leaders, just the ability to listen and have the EQ, right? If somebody is expressing themselves in a way that would not be considered the standard or the normal way, someone might express themselves, is also having the EQ to recognize like, this is part of how this person expresses themselves with boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think that's where people go is like, but then the extreme, we're not talking about somebody screaming at you or swearing at you, that sort of thing. So let's talk about like, what might this look like for a leader?
Well, let's say ADHD. It might look like very circular thinking, maybe giving too many details. I say too many, like in quotes in my head, because somebody else is saying too many, talking too long, get to the point. Where are you going with this? Why are you talking about your uncle? We're talking about this spreadsheet. There's a little bit of that's a common way that an ADHD person will think in very circular fashion and details to add understanding and to bring understanding, not to purposely mindfully go off on a tangent. There's a verbal processing that happens where for some people, they don't know what they want to say until they're saying it. They don't even understand what they think until they're saying it. And so this verbal processing to a manager might look like somebody's just going on and on and on. So I would suggest a bit more patience, because the point will come and the ideas are there. Some people just need a little bit more space to process.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing.
And I can think before we go on, I could see in your expression, like, I have another example. And I'm even thinking in this case, that as a manager, right, you might be sometimes just off the cuff, quick meetings, that sort of thing. You might get this, but if your team member is going to be leading a presentation and they're ADHD and they need this time to speak out loud and think their thoughts, well, then you definitely want this person to do a run through with some people as well, so that they get clear and they're ready to go, like at the time of the presentation. You don't leave it to the last minute.
Yes, right. In an important presentation, it would be good to have some planning, some prep work. Yes, absolutely. And the flip side of that is typically ADHDers can think very well on their feet. They're great at improvisation and spontaneity, and their intuition is good. So they do thrive in that. So you don't want to structure it and script it so much that they feel, frankly, bored by it. They'll shut down. And so because they want some of that, almost that urgency and novelty to energize them enough to be present. Does that make sense?
So not too scripted.
Yeah. I don't do well with an exact script because it doesn't allow for me to bring in whatever energy I'm reading from the room or for myself in that moment. But an outline is helpful.
Yes, like this is the path we're going to go. Yeah. Right. But it might like look different today than it would tomorrow, that sort of thing.
Yes.
What else can leaders do? Because there's listening and also understanding what your team member needs to bring their best forward. Yes. Are there other things that leaders can do to help create that environment for that people would feel comfortable in and like they belong?
Yeah, yeah. I have so many examples, so I'm going to try to just pick like the top ones. One, I would say for many neurotypes, including ADHD and autism, and from a trauma informed place too. Often it's the stimulation that dysregulates or breaks focus. So, for instance, if I'm in a room where there's a leaf blower outside or a siren outside, a fire engine passing, or it's very hot in the room or cold. If there's something where the stimulus is bothering me and dysregulating me, I'm going to have a hard time thinking and focusing and concentrating. So if somebody says, it's hot in here, can we open the window? It might sound like a, you know, request that is not all that necessary, but it might be the thing that keeps somebody able to think and process and present or whatever it is you need them to do, because the sensory overload comes really fast. It's like getting into, I always describe it to people who don't have sensory overwhelm that leads to, sometimes we call it meltdowns, just like it's overwhelming, like a hot flash, or like when you get into a hot car in the summer, and that moment where it's really, really hot and stuffy in there, and until you roll down a window or the AC kicks in, there's nothing else other than just that oppressive, overwhelming feeling of heat. And it causes a bit of panic because it's physically demanding and emotionally too. You're maybe for that moment, like you're dysregulated until the window's down, until you get air. It feels like that if I have a sound or a light or a sensation that is, to me, big, spotlighted, until it goes away or until I can modify it. It's very, very hard to focus.
Yeah. So as a facilitator of a meeting, if there's a siren going on outside, like some sort of emergency vehicle is passing by, maybe we just pause before moving on. It takes seconds probably. Yeah.
Exactly. And we don't know everybody's, we don't know everybody's trauma points. We don't know everybody's, sensitivities. So if there is a general awareness, or if you see somebody in the room who's coming in and they're wearing a hoodie or headphones, or they have a fidget toy, or they're pulling on something, like let them, because that's a way for them to feel safe in their body and regulate. So hopefully you can't hear, but downstairs my dog is barking. It's half of where my brain is. So I picked this up without you knowing, and I'm pulling on it. The dog is still barking and I could still hear it, and I'm talking about it now, but now I'm regulating and something in my body. It's almost like I'm releasing the anxiety and stress of the dog barking and you hearing it, potentially your listeners hearing it, and that's helping me. So if somebody's, doodling during a meeting, or if somebody's twisting their hair or whatever, wringing their hands, that all might be a sign of stimming, which is emotional regulation and releasing stress or anxiety from somebody's body, but also mind. And so, I tell people who are like, if I'm clicking a plan, click, 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 that's going to be aggravating for everyone in the room. So I try to encourage people to choose stimming activities that are not disruptive to everybody, but not to hold yourself in and mask up and cover up everything that you need for yourself to stay as safe as possible.
Or pretend like you're not, like distracted, or, your nervous system is taking off, to just have some practices that help you regulate that. And I'm thinking on the other side too, as a manager or a leader, like if I get a new team member, or just regular check-ins with my team members, is there anything that I can do or that you need, to support you in your work, in your job, in these meetings, that sort of thing? Like just having that curiosity of like that door is never shut. Like, we went over this checklist when you first came on the team and we're good, right? Like every now and again, like it's just a good practice for leaders to say, what can I do to support you? What is it you need to do your best work?
Absolutely. Asking is the number one way to help any employee, what can we do to help you feel successful at work, to thrive at work? How what can we do to make you more comfortable? But I also like the question, what do I not know that would help me understand you better? And that kind of opens up the door for a little deeper discussion, I like that question. But yeah, asking is beautiful, and not just in the interview. I just had a consultation with a manager who has some neurodivergent people on his team, and he just wanted to know how to navigate it better. And he was so confused because he gave them a DISC assessment, and the DISC assessment, like many other assessments for personality and different abilities, wasn't in alignment with what he was seeing. That somebody rated in one form but wasn't performing there. And I was explaining that, I don't know about you, but if I was taking a standardized test, I would be thinking about what my manager wanted to hear, because I want the job and I want to keep the job. So sometimes we mask to get the job. Sometimes we mask to keep the job, but that gets us into trouble if we are saying our capacity is more than it is, or our ability is more than it is. But often for neurodivergent people who have spent their lives being misunderstood, rejected, judged, not doing well potentially in school, especially on standardized tests, that's scary, and it's anxiety ridden. And I don't think personally that those tests are effective for many neurodivergent people who are already by definition, thinking outside of what society believes is normal, in quotes. And so we're not going to test, well, and we're not going to test in our present day that is in alignment with our future self. Like our testing self is not necessarily our self that we are going to come to work with day after day, week after week, month after month.
How we'll show up. So to underscore that point, even if there is psychological safety, there likely would be this history with standardized tests and school and assessments, or any sort of that type of activity that might create stress or need to mask what's going on, not because they completely don't trust you as their leader or the company, but this is just their history and how they're wired. So trusting what you're seeing on the job, what they're telling you, the conversations that they're having might give you more information than a standardized test would have. And I also wanted to add, one of the things that can absolutely destroy psychological safety is to ask somebody what they need, to have them tell you, and then to not follow up.
Yes. To be vulnerable, open our hearts, trust that we're being heard. That happens to me often. And then it's not heard. And there's this performative sense of, yeah, absolutely, whatever you need, or we'll take care, we'll look into that. And then nothing.
And then no.
Now I'm being asked to be more brave, come forward again, and be vulnerable again later, to ask for the accommodation again, or to come with that concern or opinion again, because it was dismissed, which is a microaggression, I think. It was just dismissed.
Yeah. Intentional or not intentional, right? Like the whole, oh, I forgot. I mean, for those of you who are listening, you're leaders, yes, sometimes we forget, but then we need to communicate that and apologize and make right, what the mistake that we made. It's all part of the repair process and relationships that is so important. But, when you're asking somebody to get vulnerable, so you can create that psychological safety, the last thing you want to happen is to forget. Do you have a challenge to share and would be willing to share with others? There's so much that can be gained by listening to what another woman is going through and to understanding the strategy that she will implement to overcome the challenge. I've seen this in the group that is currently going through the Positive Intelligence program. one woman shares a particular struggle she's having, and at least two others, if not all of the other women in the group, acknowledge they have had or currently have the same challenge. It's validating for all and beneficial to talk about the approaches that have been tried and which help the situation. For this reason, I would love to do more on-air coaching calls on this podcast. If you're a woman leader who's been promoted or taken on a new role in the last year, I invite you to apply to be on the Women Taking the Lead podcast. You will be completely anonymous, so you won't need to worry about anyone you work with listening to you talk about your challenges. You will gain insights and strategies to overcome any challenges you've been faced with at work. And the other women listening to your episode will learn from your experience and gain insights that they can use at work. You can find the link that will take you to the application in the episode description in your podcast app, or if you're listening on the Women Taking the Lead website, it will be at the bottom of the episode page. If you've been considering, I say do it. Submit the application. You and I can chat. At the very least, you will have explored the opportunity.
If somebody calls a meeting, like, we need to talk today, can you meet with me at 3? If it is 8:00 and somebody, my manager or supervisor, says we need to meet at 3, literally between 8 a.m. and 3, I'm thinking I'm getting fired. I'm catastrophizing. I'm in this rejection sensitivity, which is very common, especially with ADHD, is in full force. I'm getting nothing done. It would be so much more effective if it was, we're going to meet about this project. You're not getting fired, but we're going to talk about how, such and such can be improved, whatever, but something really specific, because I will go through every single scenario of what it could be, and it will all be bad.
Yeah, no ambiguity is not good, which goes to another thing I wanted to ask you about, which was like shaping our words to create that psychological safety. So being very clear and concise. This is what's happening. This is what you can expect. This is what I'm looking for from you. Yes. The more clarity, right? And it's a little bit extra work on our part, but even for people who are not neurodivergent, absolutely, that's incredibly helpful.
Right? Yes. What do you mean? How much? When? At what date? All of that. Yes. Specifics are very helpful. And idioms or sayings like throw you under the bus, circle back. I know what they mean, but it's not as easy to understand what it is that somebody wants me to do or what it is they're actually saying. Mm-hmm. With an autistic mind, it's very literal. And so if somebody uses sarcasm, I don't catch it. It doesn't translate. I don't pick up those nuances that other people do. And if somebody's using an idiom or a saying or an acronym, by the way, like, mm-hmm. I have it, my mind is full of so many acronyms that I don't know what they mean, that I'm Googling them constantly. And so if in a meeting you're using just acronym after acronym after acronym, and you're not at least once in the beginning of the meeting reminding people what this acronym means, is really hard for some brains. It's like math. It's just really hard.
Yeah. Or having a company index of these are the common acronyms we use in our company, what we use in our division, what we use in our department. That's, even I need that. I go into different companies and they have acronyms that I don't understand. So if I'm, often if I'm going to do an engagement, one of the first things I have to find out is like, what are the acronyms? What's the common language? Like, so that, when my participants or anyone I'm coaching uses these terms, I understand what they're talking about. It's so helpful.
Absolutely. And speaking of language, because we were also bringing in the LGBTQ lens to the lens of neurodivergence, and in terms of psychological safety, specifically with LGBTQ, it might seem obvious to many of your listeners, but using, pronouns after a name, whether it's in a meeting or at a conference, not necessarily saying them out loud every time you introduce yourself, although that's handy as well if there's new people in the room, for sure, because make sure nobody gets misgendered. But as simple as putting it at the end of your email or I have it on in my name on my Zoom meetings, or certainly if I go to a conference. If not for me, for anyone in the room who's not feeling that they could either share their gender or that they feel it would be too dangerous to do so, it opens up. It really is so huge, and very inclusive to all genders. And I think it should be across the board, just used in all ways, because otherwise, it's best to default to they. Like if you don't know, default to they, and people will struggle with that if they don't see it in writing sometimes. And so especially with the younger generations, I think this is going to become even more important as each generation is becoming more gender diverse or gender fluid. And there's many gender pronoun options outside of even she and he and they. There's many others. And so in your application process or in a form they're filling out, if you only have two options, male, female, or
or other.
What's that?
Or other. Even other is so like,
yeah,
you're all in this other ambiguous category.
Is it man, woman, or alien? That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And so, that's a simple tool that I think is often overlooked. And in terms of language, if you open your conference, ladies and gentlemen, or if you say, hey guys, to some, it's not going to bother them at all. To another person, it will not establish psychological safety. They will feel unsafe bringing their full selves to that meeting or to the event because they know that they're thinking in the binary. And every example on stage is going to be, man or woman. And every photograph they see will be a heteronormative person or couple. And so if people don't see themselves represented, they're going to leave.
Yes. Which brings me to share a piece of a conversation we had previously when I was talking with you about my audience, the audience members that I've connected with, what I know about my audience. And, one thing I shared was like, it's majority women. I know some men listen to my podcast, and you asked, do non-binary people listen to this podcast? And I said, I don't know. And what I'm very clear on is there's no invitation that I've extended for non-binary people to listen to this podcast. And so that is a task I'm putting on my to-do list now to add that language. And it doesn't, and like taking a step back for those who are listening, who might be feeling like, oh my God, this feels so overwhelming. It doesn't have to be like very complicated, just being clear. This podcast is for people of all genders.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Boom. Right there.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm just going to assume that there are many genders listening to this podcast. So when people say, I've been to events, business events, more corporate events, and I'll say, I'm not sure why nobody's using pronouns after their names. They're saying, oh, we don't have anybody trans in our company. I've had schools say, we don't need to hang the pride flag because we don't have anybody queer in our school. I'm like, statistically speaking, both of those things are completely wrong. Like, no. And it's very unlikely that either of those statements is true. But even if you're helping anybody who walks into that building or space, they're themselves, you're representing their children, you're representing their friends, you're representing people that they love and care about, who would very much appreciate seeing a pride flag or seeing pronouns on a name tag. So I think it's not just about who's in the room. It's about the people that they care about and love. And I'm sensitive to it, not only for myself, but for my neighbor. I have a pride flag out front of my home. I'm the only one on the street. And I've heard from the children in the neighborhood who probably haven't even come out to their parents yet, that every time they pass my house, just walk by it with their dog, they feel safer. For those few feet that they walk by my house, they feel safe. Like they could run up to my door and knock on the door if they needed something and they'd be safe. And that's not true everywhere. And in this, unfortunately, time that we're in, some places are quite dangerous for LGBTQ people. So if you're an organization or a leader, and as simple as putting open to all genders or putting pronouns after your name on an email or on a name tag or in your Zoom rooms, it goes a long way. I've even heard this from the Trevor Project, who is about suicidal prevention for LGBTQ youth, that using pronouns is suicide prevention, just like flat out declaration. Because if somebody doesn't feel like their identity is seen or heard or respected, then how are they going to feel like they belong ever, anywhere, right? So it's really important. And the younger generations are going to demand it if they aren't already. So
they are. Yeah. They are. And to expand the lens even more, it's a signal of shared values, because you don't even know how many employees in your organization have relatives and friends who are neurodivergent or LGBTQ, or like we could go on the whole list, but like sometimes it's just a signal of your people are important to us too.
Absolutely. And along those lines, if you have a parent who's disabled, having the lens of accessibility is going to be important to you. If you have a sibling who struggles with mental health, it's going to feel like an attack, not just to your sibling, but to you if somebody's using like crazy and schizo as just terms that they're throwing around, right? Mm-hmm. Like honoring people's experience. I went to an inclusivity conference the other day, and they were saying we really need to be careful also about trauma. And I know this is going to sound like to a lot of people out there, oh my goodness, there's so much to remember. But saying things like trauma triggers in this age of, unfortunately, a lot of violence, specifically school violence, things like triggers or don't shoot the messenger are violent. And so it's not going to necessarily cause PTSD in somebody, but it's a really good awareness. So, and my last thing is that if you're talking about, let's say, mental health or neurodivergence, and you're saying something like autism spectrum disorder or bipolar disorder, literally just drop the disorder, drop the D, drop the disorder. You could say autism, you could say bipolar. You don't need to add disorder. It's not necessary. It's pathologizing. It's stigmatizing. I know it's the way it's written in the DSM.
In a manual, right?
Yep, in the manual. But that's not the language of inclusive language within the neurodivergent community at all. Just like in the disability community, rather than saying hidden or invisible disabilities, that's not said anymore. It's non-apparent, because one, they already feel invisible and they're not hiding it. It's non-apparent. It might someday become apparent. It might be apparent to some people, but it's certainly not invisible, and it's certainly not hidden. And so that little tweak in language is empowering to the people who feel like people are respecting that. And it's just, well, frankly, it's just that we need to learn the new language as it comes, because that will retain support. I mean, all of it. You're just going to lose people if you don't respect the language around their identity.
Right. And it can be difficult. I do want to acknowledge that it's hard, because for years now, you said something, Pasha, just had my mind explode, because this is something I have been working on for years, is removing violent language from my vocabulary. And in our culture, that is so hard. And it's so hard in business when you think about targets, right? When you think, I used the expression last week, didn't even mean to, came out of my mouth, but it was really like I was trying to express this will be done and ready to go. And I said locked and loaded. Yep. Right. And we talk about crushing our goals and killing it. And like, there is so like, I'm planting a seed for everybody. And I want to say I want to apologize, but I really don't. I'm planting a seed because you are suddenly going to become aware of how much language is all around us and comes out of our own mouths that is very violent and is not inclusive. Like we don't realize, like we may not be like causing people to run from the room, but people, I know I do too. When people use that language, it's like kind of like, oh, okay. Like that's very it's a military term, or it's about hunting and killing something. And, and we use these terms to talk about people and projects and like, even like good things like ending cancer. We use very violent language towards it. But anyway, so where I want to go now, Pasha, because we could talk forever, is so for those who are listening, how do they continue their own development to sharpen their lens for inclusion and intersectionality? Because this is like a jumping off point, but we want to keep this work going.
Yeah. Certainly listening to and absorbing content from people in the field of disability inclusion, neurodiversity affirming, and folks who are showing it with consistency, not just performatively. So taking in content, there's some excellent, I go on LinkedIn when I want to learn, and I very specifically and mindfully seek out people with the most intersecting marginalized identities, because they're the ones who will fully understand, the direction we need to go. And so I would suggest that. I offer, and many people do, consultations and trainings in virtual and live, going to businesses and talking to them about whether it's inclusive language or how to manage a neurodivergent team or intergenerational leadership. I think
that was my next question for you, Pasha, was like, what are some of the presentations and trainings that you do for organizations? Because I know organizations are hungry for this, to have their leaders and their employees get trained on how to create these safe environments.
Yeah, through consultation and trainings and then keynotes, what I do is I will either talk about intergenerational leadership, like this is coming. These are the needs of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And by the way, it includes a lot about neurodivergence and gender fluidity and a lot of the things we already talked about, and disability inclusion. So all those things are noted. And then I also talk about neurodiversity-affirming practices, which is a lot about assuming competency and letting go of stigma and allowing for autonomy, talking to people about the benefits of remote work and why for some people it's the only way they can work from a sensory perspective, but also a disability perspective. There's so much I'll table that, but like remote and hybrid work, I think is really important when you're trying to support your neurodivergent and or disabled employees. And then I'll talk about neuroqueering, which is not just the intersection of neurodiversity and queerness, but this idea that we need to lead differently. We need to manage differently. We need to start to challenge the status quo of the way things used to be done and the way things are done now to really accommodate for a changing workforce. And so that could look like challenging some norms, challenging our language, like we were doing in this very episode, starting to question things like, why do we do it this way? Just like it almost around everything we do at work. Why do we do it this way? Why do we say it this way? And that really brings some nice humility and curiosity and empathy to leadership that I really appreciate. So I would say those are the top topics that I speak on and train on. And then of course, depending on who I'm speaking to, customize it and individualize it for either their team or the managers or the ERGs. I talk to a lot of ERGs, LGBTQ or neurodiversity or disability. And sometimes a lot of organizations are starting to do intersectional ERGs, which I think makes a lot of sense, where there'd be like a neurodivergent and LGBTQ combined ERG that helps people feel seen more.
Absolutely. Because as human beings, we are intersectional, right? We are not just one thing. So it makes sense for all these ERGs, if not like combining, at least to be collaborating
Yeah,
together to create programs and discussion groups and what have you.
absolutely. And then I guess the final thing I would say is, all of this includes mental health struggles. Like anything in the DSM and any mental health struggle is considered a neurodivergence. And also that requires a certain amount of support. Does your company allow for mental health days? Does your company offer insurance that includes therapy, or medications, or so I just think it's really important, especially now. Obviously the world has gone through a heck of a lot over the last few years, and there's a lot of collective trauma and a lot of mental health struggles out there, adults and youth. And I think we need to be aware of that, especially now.
And where to get help, which then leads me to ask you, Pasha, where can people find you and connect with you so they can have conversations about potentially bringing you in to help them in their organizations as well?
Great. Well, I'm the CEO of Neurobelonging, and my website is neurobelonging.org. I'm all over LinkedIn and many social media channels, but LinkedIn's my favorite. That's under my name, Pasha Marlowe. Those are the best ways to find me. You can also email me, pasha@pashamarlowe.com.
Well, Pasha, thank you so much for taking the time to inspire and enlighten us. We are all better for having met you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jody. And thank you, everyone listening. I can't wait to meet you and talk to you further.
Thank you so much for listening to Women Taking the Lead. If you are not yet subscribed to the podcast, hit the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Most new discoveries come from our friends, family, and colleagues. And as always, I hope this was of value to you, and here's to your success.